today with our good colleagues and friends and partners for sustainable development, UNDP and UNDP. I'm happy that this important session had this kind of attention despite the competition and the fact that many of you have been already in many sessions during the last 2 weeks. But this session is going to address a very important topic that had been the center of many discussions during the high-level political forum, directly and indeed indirectly. So let me tell you how we're going to organize this session that I started with all of the good intentions for it to be effective and productive. So we'll start with an update on the state of equity and inequality by our chief economist for equitable growth, finance and institutions at the World Bank Group, Mr. William Maloney. And after that, we will have directly the discussion led first by Her Excellency, the Minister of Planning and Administrative Reforms and Follow-up, Dr. Hala Saeed. Then I'm happy as well as we are tackling matters at the country level. We have, as we have been pushing, that matters related to sustainable development need to have an emphasis on local development, localization of activities, addressing the issues where really it matters. So today we have the Executive Director for the Commission on Gender Equity of New York City at New York City Mayor's Office, Ms. Jacqueline E. Banks. After that, she's here, and then after that, Mr. Elliot Harris, I think who had enough of me at least today. We started the day together in a session at 8 o'clock in the morning, but he's still with good energy to tell us more about what the UN system as the chief economist and the Assistant Secretary General at UNDP, Mr. Elliot Harris, is going to provide us an update on what's happening. And then Ms. Ulrika Mudir, the Assistant Secretary General and Director of Bureau for External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP, one of the very strong partners with the World Bank Group, not just in such fora, but indeed in the field where it matters. And the director of the Center of International Cooperation at New York University, who had a very interesting career as well at the World Bank Group, Ms. Sarah Cliff, but now she's doing many interesting matters that prove that your life after the World Bank could be as exciting and productive to the benefit of the people. Not encouraging anyone, especially my team here, to have other thoughts, but while you are here, we are respecting you and happy to have you. So let's start with the facts, and then I think very much the case that I'll be really emphasizing, and we have the minutes until my very good, able chief economist will finish his words, give us more, not on updates on what's happening just on the diagnosis, but what we are doing better, what we are doing differently. You have people from different countries, different organizations, different agencies. They could be very much interested in the good news, but perhaps how are you dealing with the challenges and the bad news? This is a very important topic, as we can see with the different dimensions of it. So, Mr. Maloney, the floor is yours.
I'm actually not going to give an update on where we are, both because it's impossible to do in 7 minutes, and also because it's been done a fair amount, and there's been a lot of discussion around it. Yeah. So what I decided to do instead was to just highlight 3 areas that I think we have to keep our eyes on as we target the SDGs going forward. Please. So there's 3 areas. The first is what's happening with technological progress, and there's been a lot of discussion around it, but the question is whether the same forces that allowed us to bring manufacturing to many of our client countries and lift the bottom of the population distribution there, and allow countries like, for instance, China to achieve massive convergence and allow big increases in improvements in the SDGs globally as a result. Whether that's going to continue or whether there are forces within that which are going to undo us. And the concern is the following. Next, please. Automation is being held as culpable for the hollowing out of the manufacturing base in the advanced countries. If you look, we always have these little robots here to the left, but if you look at the first panel, that is the rate of job growth over the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades in the advanced countries. And you see that on both the ends of the distribution, where we have legislatures and managers, professionals, and all, as well as at the very bottom, we have job growth. But in the middle, when there are operators and assemblers and the like, there's been a decrease. And this hollowing out of the manufacturing class has been visible throughout the advanced countries. The question is that dynamic also going to affect what's going on in the developing countries? And relatedly, if robots and automation are taking the jobs in the advanced countries, what does this do to the flying geese pattern, where countries progressively hand down stages of the global value chain to progressively to poorer countries and pull them out of poverty one by one? Because if there's reshoring through automation, then that dynamic stops. And the first thing to say, the next slide, please. Next slide. The evidence we have to date, and on this slide I will stop on the first part. The evidence we have to date is that if you look at this graph, the red line, there's been the increase in employment of robots has led to a decline in employment and manufacturing in the advanced countries. But that blue line that goes up says, no, that's not happening in developing countries so far. And most of that is because of offshoring, exactly, and that's being driven by Slovenia and the like. And what happens is when multinationals relocate in Slovenia or Mexico or whatever, they bring robots and they also bring people, they also hire manufacturing employees, and so that complementarity goes on. Will that continue going forward, or have we kind of seen the first phase of that expansion of offshoring, and from now on the substitution effect will dominate? That is something we have to watch, because in Mexico and Brazil, we are seeing signs of the same hollowing out that we've seen in the advanced countries. Next. The other is the last mile in alleviating extreme poverty in the world is going to require focusing on rural sectors and agricultural productivity in particular. And this, we're going to have to be boosting agricultural productivity and output at the same time that the climate change is working against us. Next, please. Just look, this is a graph of where the sources of growth in productivity have happened in sources of growth in agricultural production have happened around in developing countries over the last decades. And you see that orange part, that's productivity. That's because the gains from more land or more fertilizer have been decreasing over time, and more it's applying knowledge to agriculture, bringing in new crops, new ways of producing crops and the like, and that is where productivity is going to come from. This becomes more important, next please, as we look at what's going to happen as the climate continues to warm up. You see these red areas are the areas that will be most affected by climate change. Those are exactly in the areas where the poorest of the world global poor are to date. And so we are going to be having to find new ways of making agriculture productive and of finding new crops, new technologies to deal with the changing climate. That's going to require more agricultural research and development and better diffusion of knowledge throughout this region. However, next please, if we look at what, for instance, Africa has been spending exactly on R&D, it's been declining in over half of the African countries, and I believe this is in nominal terms, so that means it's actually a little bit more severe, which means that exactly at the time that we really, really need to be stepping up agricultural research and improving the quality of research and extension services throughout our poorest countries, they're getting weaker. That's something to think about. Next, please. Finally, and here I will let my colleagues at the panel start speaking, something called convergence of aspirations. We've been focusing on very concrete measures of poverty, but what I want to present is some data on how people think about their well-being relative to the rest of the world, and where there's been a convergence, a catching up of the poorest of the global poor on that front. And I want to present first this graph, which shows across for various different regions the self-reported well-being of individuals around the world. And here we have on the bottom axis, we have from the poorest on the left and then moving to the right, the richest. And as you expect, people feel better about themselves in general as they have more income. And if you look at the regional graphs, you see that richer regions tend to feel better about themselves than poorer regions. That's not surprising. If you look 20 years later, however, you see something very interesting. At the very top of the income distribution, whereas before you saw if you didn't live in a very prosperous region, the elites of that region kind of felt not very good. Well, now all elites globally feel pretty good. Why is that? It's because they can get the New York Times online. It's because they get Netflix online. Because they can get, in Bogota, you can get most everything you can get in Washington and live a lot more cheaply and have more help around the house. Okay, so that's something that technology has brought to the upper end of the spectrum. But what's interesting is at the bottom end of the spectrum, we've seen almost no progress whatsoever, despite all the progress in the SDGs and on GDP and of incomes of these people over the last 25 years. Why is it that they don't report any higher satisfaction despite this progress? And I want to make the following suggestion, which is that they're looking around more and more too. The same things that are allowing the elites to be happily plugged into the rest of the world, the poor also have the internet, and they know exactly how their cousin in London is living. And that makes them feel a little bit less good than if they didn't know that. So what we did is we actually asked, we took from the survey we had, we asked if there was any inclination towards migrating, and if so, where? And we used that as the reference income for that particular person. And then we ran a couple of regressions, basically trying to identify what happened to your self-measured well-being if your reference income rose. So I'm sitting there in Nigeria, and London's income rises. How do I feel about that? And what you have, next slide, is it makes you feel worse. Okay. On average, if the reference incomes go up by 10%, we need to have 5% increase in income of our home country citizens in order for them to feel as good as they felt before. That's just to stay in the same place we were before. And if you look at the very poor, it's actually more like 20%. So if incomes go up in London 10%, we need to raise the incomes of the poorest of the poor 20% in order for them just to be as happy as they were before. This obviously raises the challenges of keeping people happy where they are, makes it a much more difficult challenge. So those three things keep me up a bit at night, and I will just leave it here. Next slide, please. Just wanted to flag this last point on agricultural productivity and agricultural investment is in the last volume that's coming out in the Productivity Project. So give that a look.
Right, okay. Lots of ideas, knowledge updates, and more to come if you follow the suggestion, if you see all of these important reports coming out from the World Bank Group in partnership with many people as well. But let me get you back before I ask the panelists to intervene on one important report that many perhaps didn't see it, on the poverty puzzle, and why we are saying at the bank that despite the effort, as you mentioned several times, dealing with challenges, it seemed that poverty, quoting the bank report, is very much stubborn against any kind of measure, especially with the countries that suffer from high inequality. And we see that the solution perhaps should be from inequality-related policies rather than growth in order to lower extreme poverty.
How do I feel about that?
Yeah. You can distance yourself from the report for a minute, but
in terms of, in general, I'm in favor of building human capital at the bottom of the pyramid, and I believe that works directly on reducing inequality and also leads to growth on the overall in the economy as well. I also think that conditional cash transfer programs around the world have worked pretty well in reducing inequalities without being too distortionary and not impeding growth too much.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for that. So invest in human capital and
so
health and education.
If Yeah, if your question is on whether I am in favor of also working towards direct measures of redistribution, those are the ones that I would focus on.
All right. Okay. Very good. Very good. And okay, so I'll come back to you with another question that you should be more familiar with the answer to it, based on the good work of Professor Chetty on the impact of education on social mobility as well. But I'll leave it to perhaps to the end of the discussion, and benefiting, of course, from what will come from the minister and from New York as well, on the impact of education and human capital on social mobility, and why the same kind of investment that you can put in human capital could result in more mobility in some particular context and may not really result in the same outcome in another. Honorable Minister.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. I'd like to thank, of course, yourself, the World Bank, the UNDP, and UNDESA for inviting me to speak in a very important session. Actually, the idea of inequality is of crucial importance. It is not only we're not only addressing the SDG 10, but actually the issue of inequality is cross-cutting all other SDGs. Let me here give you an idea about the inequality in Egypt. Where do we stand in terms of some inequalities that we face, and what are the policies that we're doing to address such inequalities? And let me start by saying that when we talk about inequality of wealth, and I think here when we are at the UN and we're talking about such issue, I think there is a need from all international organizations and partners to start revisiting the measurement of inequality of wealth specifically. Because if we look at how do we measure inequality of wealth, we usually use the Gini coefficient. And if we look into Egypt, for example, we'll find that this measurement have been stable over the years, have been stable over the past 10 to 15 years. However, the perception that there is an increase in inequality. And the main thing here in the methodology is that most of the household surveys that are being taken usually do not reach some segments of the population, or they do not disclose the right information, especially the higher segment of the population, or usually the household surveys do not address, for example, gated communities, where gated communities are on the rise in most of the developing countries. So I think this is one of the issues that we need to look into with in more depth. These shortcomings, I think, is very important. However, one of the important inequalities is the regional inequality. Inequality inside the country between one governorate and the other, or one region and the other. If we look, of course, into rural areas and Upper Egypt specifically, we find that level of poverty is basically double the level of poverty in other regions in Cairo. And this, of course, I will come in a while to say how are we addressing this regional disparities, because I think it's very pressing to not only, as Mr. Maloney was mentioning, when you look into other countries that are developing and you feel yourself more inferior, that this country is developing more, but inside the same country you find regions that are developing extremely and the other regions are lagging behind in services, in wealth, in everything. The other thing is that the gender inequality. The gender inequality in Egypt, a lot of emphasis for the past 3 to 4 years are on women and on gender. On women in terms of leadership of women, we are pushing very hard to push women leaders to become role models, because this has a great spillover effect on a lot of young women and on the society in general. However, still female labor participation is very low. if we look into the disparities in the unemployment and the inequality in the unemployment, still the unemployment of women are 3 times as much as the unemployment of the male. Although for the first time the unemployment rate kicked down the level of 20%. We usually remained between 24 and 25% unemployment of female. Now for the first time, this unemployment level went down to 19%, which is, I think, a major achievement. However, it is still 3 times as much as the unemployment of the male. The other thing is that a lot of female are becoming educated. There is an increase in the level of education of female. However, their participation rate in the workforce is very low. Okay, what are we doing to address these issues? Because there are policies that I think during the past 3 years have worked to help minimize these levels of inequality. If we look into the income inequality, first we started by reforming the subsidy system. We had a huge subsidy system in Egypt where we used to subsidize fuel, electricity, water. We have subsidy cards for food. So we started reforming this subsidy system. We started reducing the subsidies and the benefits that used to go to the rich, especially the fuel and electricity, and we started rechanneling these subsidies to conditional cash transfers to the poorest of the poor and to health and education. So we now have a very big program, which is the conditional cash transfers. It's the Kaful and Karama, which is being given to the poorest of the poor, and especially to women who are taking care of their children. The other thing is that we started channeling this to a new education system that is not relying basically on memorizing, but this new system is basically relying on critical thinking, on technology, on innovation. So we started this from in the kindergarten and the first year in education. The other thing is that we started a huge initiative on health. I think it's the largest on the world, of detecting virus C to about 50 million people in Egypt, in addition to a new initiative to detect all health problems to women like breast cancer, anemia, obesity, and some others. So we are reforming through the subsidy system. We are rechanneling these amounts of money to health and education. The other thing is that a lot of inequality in wealth is related to the informal sector. So working through the formal sector, and especially the small and micro enterprises. The small and micro enterprises, trying to attract them. Because most of the people say, leave the informal sector. They are employing people. Leave them alone, but trying to attract them to come to the formal sector will not be except with incentives. They are at their comfort zone. So they are not paying taxes, they are not suffering from any red tape, so just leave them alone. So in order to attract them, you need to incentivize them. So we started by a new SME law that give them a 5-year tax holiday, and after that we're going to give them a flat tax on their work, in addition to giving them the work and having complexes. Moving, for example, we had a huge informal complex for plastic. We moved this informal sector for plastic into a new complex, registered with license, and we just give each one his license and his complex in order to join the formal sector. The gender inequality, as I mentioned, we have a women's strategy that is aligned directly to the strategy 2030 of Egypt. It's at the heart of the strategy. We're following this very harshly every quarter. We're working on 2 directions. The first direction is, as I said, empowering women to become leaders in every institutions. Now we have 8 ministers in the cabinet, which is about 30% of the female, heading most of the important portfolios in the cabinet. We have about 25% in the new constitution parliamentarians trying to support every woman with the capacity building programs. We have a women leadership program with the University of Minnesota, in addition to supporting women who are working in the microfinance sector. So we are now giving a lot of access to finance to these women. The women inclusion now that are working in the formal sector and having access to finance increased from 7% in 2015 to 27% in 2019. So female participation, in addition to providing nurseries with the support of CSR from the banks to all governments and all public institutions that need nurseries in order. Just one last thing, which is the regional disparity. We have a lot of regional disparities between governorates, so we started with through targeting the developmental gaps through localization of the SDGs. We're working on localization of the SDGs and decentralization of public investment and offering these governorates with a lot of services. Finally, I think that the most important inequality is inequality of opportunity. So investing in health, investing in education, in capacity building, and we're investing a lot in capacity building. We're privileged with a huge number of young people. It is a challenge. 60% of our population are under the age of 30. It's a major challenge, but it is also a great opportunity. So we are investing a lot. We have a new academy specifically to train for free all the young people of Egypt, giving them the right chance, empowering them. We have a young assistant minister who is sitting in front of me, who has just been hired as an assistant minister. She's 29 years old. So we are investing in them and we are empowering them at the same time. Thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, 29 years of age, and she's getting younger. It seems that she is happy working in the government. And well, I don't do the time management. It's those two colleagues there who give me some hard looks. So please look at them. Don't look at me if I have to send you that note. So now, from a country perspective to a very important city with well, could be a size of many countries as well. But let me say how matters related to equity, especially with a focus on gender dimension, are being handled in this great host city of ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about how New York City is moving to advance gender equity in an integrated way. And so what I want to talk about today are really four things, if you will. The critical importance of executive voice, that the leadership of the city needs to articulate a deep value in equity, and clearly that's what we have currently in our Mayor Bill de Blasio. That from his first term has been his mantra and his commitment to ensure that we're a city that is responsive to all its citizens. And as that relates to gender, what that means for us is, regardless of gender identity, regardless of gender expression, all New Yorkers should have the ability to live economically secure lives, that we should all have the ability to access affordable and quality health care, that we should all have full autonomy over our reproductive lives, and really we should live free from violence in our homes, in our workplaces, and in our communities. So that's sort of what we have used in building out the Commission on Gender Equity and the work that it has to do. In fact, when the mayor created this commission, he said, New York City is spiritually defined by inclusion and diversity, and it's imperative that all New Yorkers, regardless of sex, gender, or sexual orientation, are treated equally. This new historic commission will help us use every tool we have to create a truly equitable city for all New Yorkers. And so, you know, I like to emphasize the every tool. And that means we need to be intentional about our work, and we need to have tools that give us public accountability. And with that, we're able to determine our progress, determine our challenges, and work across city agencies to drive coordinated change. I think we also, and in so doing, I want to talk about our voluntary local review document, which, and I'll just hold it up here as show and tell. This is our second review that has been developed by our Mayor's Office of International Affairs and Commissioner Penny Abewardena, which really is a tool that helps us determine, again, based on our strategic plan, our city strategic plan 1 NYC, determine how we are progressing towards equity on various indicators, and both of which are aligned with the UN SDGs. And so if you can understand that within every city agency, we have this through line from an international response to a city response and then to a local city agency response. And I want, for the Commission on Gender Equity, that response is embedded in our strategic plan, which is a 4-year plan that was developed. And so what's really important in this is that all these documents are coordinated and interconnected. When we look at gender, we think about intersectionality. And that's a really important construct for us in a city that is as incredibly diverse as New York. We want to be mindful of everyone's age and see things in complexity and not in a really simple approach to this work. So age, ability, faith, socioeconomic status, immigrant status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, those are all critical elements when we think about developing policy and when we think about working with others, our fellow city agencies, that we're moving the needle in terms of driving equity. For the last thing for us that's very important as the mayor's term comes to an end in 2021 is sustainability. We'll be making incredible, and we have been making incredible strides. How do we ensure that this is sustained beyond this administration? One key way of doing that is ensuring that this work is owned by community. And so we invest greatly in connecting with community to do our work. And so for the past month, the Commission on Gender Equity, in June, we went to the 5 boroughs and held gender equity summits. And at those summits, we have 3 new programs that we want to launch. And our goal was to get community voice impacting the design of the programs. The 3 are, we want to increase male engagement in the fight for gender equity. What should that look like? Where should these individuals be found? How do we communicate with that? It is best and essential for us to be informed by community in order to do this work. The other population is youth. Our commission has 32 members and the average age is now about 50. So we need to find an innovative way to bring young voices to the table. And so again, having community inform that. And last but not least, leadership. It's really important as we move forward to ensure that we have huge diversity, including gender diversity, in the leaders from our very local level, our community boards, to our elected offices. And those are things that we're working with community to drive. I'm going to stop here because I got the time pulled on me, and I want to be mindful of my colleagues, but hopefully, we can have a deeper exchange as we move forward. Thank you.
So, Elliot, leaving no one behind, and we have been getting a variety of updates on the state of SDGs. Do you still stand by this? Is it still aspirational or operational, a kind of a phrase? And what we should be expecting from the summits at the margins of ANGA to help achieving the goal of leaving no one behind?
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. It's still aspirational, unfortunately. What I'm going to say is drawn from the data that we put together for the SDG Progress Report. And what that shows is, when you look at the global level, and you look more or less at the trends, one could say that there has been some progress. We see that, for example, the income of the poorest 40% of populations globally that income has accelerated at a speed that's higher than the national averages. In more than half of the countries where there are data available, we see that some of the other indicators of inequality are improving. The cost of sending remittances to developing countries is going down. The number of tariffs being faced by small island developing states are coming down. But again, these are trends that are at the global level, and they do not distinguish between individual country circumstances. We have also seen over a period of the last couple of decades that some regions have actually made quite significant progress overall in addressing inequality. Latin America and the Caribbean come to mind. They've managed to reduce the Gini coefficient in 17 of the 19 countries over the past 25 years. But that progress too is slowing. Now, you dig down a little bit deeper and you start to look in a more differentiated way what the data is saying, we find that overall growth, although it seems to have been reasonably steady for the last couple of years, and it had been higher in years before, but that growth has not been equally distributed across different regions of the world. And we find that the uneven growth masks the fact that the growth performance of the regions that most need growth in order to address inequality, that growth performance has not been at the level it should be. Now, what we will see is that per capita incomes are stagnating in many parts of Africa, in Western Asia, and in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that, of course, is a very clear sign that we're going to see further difficulties with income inequality. The challenge is most acute in Africa in particular, where over the past 5 years, per capita income growth has grown by 0.3%, and that is simply not enough to make a dent in poverty. In fact, we've done some analyses, and it shows that for those countries in Africa where per capita incomes have been weakest, they will need to achieve double-digit growth rates for the rest of the SDG period if they are going to meet SDG 1. And that, of course, is a very steep challenge that none of them are in a position to make at this time. So there has to be a combination of not only better economic growth, but improved policies to address the existing inequality and to prevent the trends towards inequality from getting any worse. All of this happens, however, in a situation where the space for policy is much more constrained. Many governments are very highly indebted. They have no room to greatly increase expenditures, to increase the investments that would be needed to generate that kind of double-digit growth. And so we do see a shadow on the prospects of reducing inequalities and achieving the full range of SDGs in the absence of major changes in policy. Go down a level further and start looking within countries, and we see that the growth itself, whatever growth there is just simply not translating into improvements in individual outcomes. More than 2/3 of the world's population, if we look away from borders, more than 2/3 of the people who live on this planet are living in places where there's been a deterioration in the inequality situation, where income and wealth disparities are actually rising. And a lot of that has to do with factors that are beyond anybody's ability. It depends in many respects on where you were born, what your gender is, what your ethnic identity is, whether you have a disability. These are characteristics that tend to determine whether or not an individual has a prospect of improving their income situation, of improving their relative status in their society. And the biggest discriminatory factor of them all is your gender. If one is a woman, one can expect to be paid less, have less opportunity to have a job, have less access to political representation or to political power more broadly. And these are things that have not been addressed through policy and can only be addressed through policy. And they also determine the access to opportunity. And so here in particular, we see a real challenge for policymakers around the world. Unless we address these factors in particular, the ones that are beyond anybody's control, the income inequalities will perpetuate themselves over generations. People will have less income now, and that situation passes itself on to the next generation. But in addition to that, there are some mega trends that we think are or have the capacity to further exacerbate the income inequality problem. Climate change is one. The ones who are most likely to be left behind, all other things being equal, those are the ones who are also most vulnerable to climate change. And the ones least equipped, least resilient to that climate change. And so as the process of climate change proceeds, it will be deepening and exacerbating these inequalities among those who are already severely disadvantaged. The second element is technology. It is driving change. It has the potential to be a hugely positive contributor to development, but again, not everyone is equally well placed to benefit from the technology. And we do have a digital divide between countries and within countries, and that divide is increasingly gender-based as well. And unless that is addressed through policy, we run the risk that technology reinforces, drives, and accelerates the deepening of inequality going forward. And yet, inequality is not destiny. This can be dealt with through positive policies that address the root causes of the inequality and do so in a comprehensive and consistent manner across a range of different interventions. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thanks. Now, UNDP has a great deal of involvement in the acceleration of the SDG at the country level, acceleration labs, MAPS initiative, helping in policy design, investment in opportunities. So, Ms. Mudir, what could be said on your behalf on this, or perhaps more related to dealing with the challenges of inequality?
Thank you. And speaking about MAP's mission, I think it has been mapped out more or less where we are today. Having said that, I do think that sometimes it is also important for us within the UN and the international community to also see what we have done and believe that we can do with more information and understanding of where we're heading similar things also for tomorrow, because hope is really what we need to bring of the world of today. So just a reminder that we actually, since '96, have reduced extreme income poverty from 36% to 8%. But then, of course, as we have heard several of my colleagues here saying, we are now in a situation where we see this stagnating, where we see new challenges such as climate change, and I will come back to that. But also where we see, and this certainly also has been identified by UNDP with our presence in 170 countries and our assignment to work with a broad range of the Sustainable Development Goals, inequality is one of the major stumbling blocks that we see that we need to address also with new policies and practices. And there we want to use the worldwide network of UNDP. We need to work together with others, as we do here, sitting together. You have most probably seen that we, this week, has launched the multi-dimension poverty index. Even though we know that we have data and understanding here, we need to improve even more, and we do that working also together with the World Bank and UNICEF, bringing our different capacities together in order to read realities, but also hopefully then the future. And I think several interesting things have been said here with regard to that. One of the other areas where we have said that we also need to improve UNDP's offer, given that UNDP is actually giving support to at least 140 of the member states, is the challenge of climate change and how this will exacerbate, as has been said, also the inequality that we see. And also perhaps the inequality that people perceive. I think that what was mentioned initially about perception is critically important for us to understand also these drivers of populism and nationalism that is also a hindrance for the international community to address some of these challenges. UNDP is critical to give support to countries now developing their national determined contributions, that those are the climate promises that the member states are given in line with the Paris Agreement. And these need also to be aligned with central budgets and planning processes, and of course be part of the idea that Sustainable Development Goals is bringing the three aspects of sustainability together. That is, how can we also give a promise to the coming generations and people having this perception that there is no hope in the world of today, that those plans where we address climate change also actually can be plans where we support countries in developing new energy systems that can also drive economic development in an inclusive way, bringing also the countryside into the economic development in a way that has not been seen before, and then of course also different social dimensions. So I think that the task for us, 2020, new NDCs, more ambitious NDCs needs to be in place, also to see to that they become SDG aligned is very important, and of course we cannot do this alone, but we need to do that in coordination with others. Gender equality has been mentioned. I think that this is a task for everyone, but also then, of course, as has been said, a huge opportunity, because we know it's not only that we see inequality playing out different, both with relation to gender, but of course not also looking at intersectionality, but also that if we really give women the rights and the opportunities through representation, as was also mentioned in the case of Egypt, we know that this will also decrease inequality in a way that is very important. What else? Yes, of course, financing for development and innovation, Mahmoud, as you mentioned in the beginning. I think our main task, of course, is to give policy advice how to align with the Sustainable Development Goals and the NDCs, but also the opportunity to turn those plans into more of investment plans. And together as institutions, see where there are funding gaps, where we know that traditional ODA, as we have said in the Financing for Development Agreement, will not be able to take us to those ambitious goals of the 2030 agenda, but where we need to find other investment opportunities. And I do believe that the way we plan and give advice to countries how to plan can also open up for those opportunities. And the work of UNDP also strengthening institutions, working with rule of law, with governance, human rights, and so is also, of course, then a way of supporting countries to de-risk, as the market says, and also bring those investments to projects. Speaking about projects, also there is, of course, a need to develop bankable projects. That's perhaps not the task of UNDP, but certainly working together with others, we can make the SDG planning and also the planning of the national determined contributions also as investment opportunities. And then acceleration. Yes, we need to accelerate. We are going in reverse in relation to several of the goals. Even though we see that extreme poverty is declining, we could see also this week with the report on the SDGs that hunger is actually on the increase. Something that has not been mentioned here in the panel today that we could perhaps add is that when we look at the poverty map worldwide, the protracted crisis and the conflicts that we see worldwide is, of course, also where we see poverty and real concerns on how to change that situation. And UNDP is very much present in these conflict-ridden countries and regions. And this is, of course, a huge concern when we look at the diversity, or whatever we call it, of the poverty map across the world. With a world with more protracted crisis and conflicts, we see new patterns of poverty that we haven't seen before. So we need to innovate and work differently. UNDP has launched this year 60 innovation acceleration labs, as we call them. The idea, they are across the world, the majority of them in the Africa region. And the idea is to find local solutions and really bring them forward and use also then the global network of UNDP, bringing the best ideas, scalable at regional level, but also at global level where this is possible. And I think that these acceleration labs also opens up for different actors to come in. Sometimes we continue working, planning, evaluating amongst ourselves, while we do need to open up for local solutions, bringing in local actors to the table as international institutions. So please follow our work with the Accelerator Labs. And my time is up, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Very good. And of what you mentioned is of great relevance to my question and what I'm expecting of an answer from Sarah Cliff, who's been leading lots of good work and research on how to deal with different challenges in countries suffering from fragility or being in conflict or post-conflict, including aspects related to inequality. So, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. And like others, I will talk more about solutions than more analysis of the problem. And I'll base what I say on a bit of work that has just been done by the Pathfinders multi-stakeholder Partnership for Peace, Justice and Inclusion. This is a group of 30 countries, the UN, the World Bank, civil society, who have looked at inequality and inclusion across the agenda, so including Goal 10, but also including inclusive cities, equal access to education, non-discrimination, access to justice, inclusive decision-making in Goal 16, inclusive institutions. And I'll make 5 very quick points, getting more practical and detailed as I go along. The first is that inequality is of universal political concern across high, middle and low-income countries. And Bill Maloney's presentation talked about perceptions of one's welfare in relation to others. And this is really why it is of central political concern. So countries in every region and income group, from Sweden to the UK to Mexico to Indonesia to Ethiopia to Sierra Leone to Timor-Leste to Korea, are telling us that this issue is crucial to them. Now, as Mahmoud said and Ulrika, in the countries that are conflict affected, we also know from the World Bank UN study that there is a direct link between inequalities and conflict. Second, to understand this central political concern, I think we have to focus on why inequality is different from poverty reduction. It's about the top of the income spectrum as well as the bottom. And this is why our primary indicator, the bottom 40% moving faster than the national average, may not in fact be an adequate measure to understand why this is such a central preoccupation. Because in fact, if the top incomes in society rise even faster, you can make progress on that measure, but inequality will still increase. And so I would argue may popular anger. And this is one of the things that we are seeing. Third, inequality is about both material and non-material issues. So both group-based inequality and socioeconomic inequality, of course, is about people having tangible jobs, assets, wealth. And that's as important for gender equity or equity among ethnic groups as it is for socioeconomic equity. But also, both are about respect, dignity, respect for people as human beings and as equal citizens. So when we've had in this country the use of the term deplorables, for instance, or in the Middle East the concept of hogra, the contempt of elites for the population, this is about a non-material issue. And the SDG agenda, because of its emphasis also on economic, social and political inclusion, recognises that. On policy solutions, I don't have time to go into detail, so I'll make 2 general points. There are a set of policies where we know what works technically, but the politics of those policies are difficult. So those include progressive taxation of income and wealth. We know how to do this. There's no mystery in how to design a system that will do this. The barrier is, how do you build the political support to be able to do it? It's also true of health, education and empowering social services in general terms, and there are some excellent examples, in fact many of them from the global south, about how to provide social protection which is also empowering and gives dignity. So in these areas, and last I should say it's also about labour policies on minimum wages, for instance. So in these areas it's not so much a technical constraint, it's that we need to look at the evidence about what works politically. And there are some great examples, for instance Indonesia's combination of universal health with targeted benefits, with assistance to vulnerable groups, and how that built a coalition politically to support. Second set of policies, and this is my last point, where we know they're important, but we do actually lack evidence on how to address them. These include spatial inclusion, which the Minister mentioned. I think as well as thriving cities and lagging regions, there's increasing evidence that housing is an unattended area we should have paid more attention to. Shared capital, because the technological risks Bill Maloney talked about indicate that we should look at what people own, not just the income they get from labour. The digital economy's use to resolve inequality, there are some excellent examples here, and political inclusion. And here, Mahmoud, I'll come back to the question about countries that have gone through transition from conflict. That here they actually have some of the best examples of mechanisms to build national unity and cohesion, because they know about it from painful experience. So Sierra Leone, for instance, is at the moment establishing a political cohesion commission, not now because it's after a conflict, it's 20 years since the conflict, but because they realise that after a divisive election, in order to build that national unity and inclusion, you may want to take deliberate action. So I would just conclude by saying that inequality is not destiny, as Elliot said. There are lots of examples of countries that have made progress, and we should draw hope from those examples.
Very good. Thank you so much. Now, it's your time. Despite the fact it's not equal, yeah, absolutely. So let's hear it from you. If you have questions, comments. Yes, sir. To the right here. Please introduce yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Masanori from Ocean Policy Research Institute, Japan. Thank you for wonderful presentations. I have a questions to Mr. William Meroni about this presentation, particularly on this relation between climate change and agriculture. And I see some regions having agricultural increase in the future, the other regions losing the agricultural productions. Would that have a kind of impact on the international trade of the agriculture, and this increase in one region can offset the decrease in other region, or it can create a kind of increasing pressures on, for instance, fishery resources or any other type of protein sources? I just wondered if you can give us a bit of future projections under this scenario of climate change and agriculture. Thank you.
Right, okay. For the panel to keep their answers for now until we hear more questions or comments from the floor. Any suggestions, any comments, questions, ideas, agreements, disagreements, reflections of happiness? Yes, madam, or unhappiness. Yeah. Yes.
Just a question about the indicators. As you know, some of the indicators will be reviewed. Will there be support from the panelists for an SDG indicator on inequality, like the Gini coefficient? And secondly, there is a risk that some of the tier 3 indicators might be lost, and one of those is the one on discrimination, perceptions of discrimination. And I would just ask that whether panelists will be supporting keeping that indicator as well, because the methodology, sorry, my name is Sally-Ann Way from OHCHR, and we are the custodian agency for the discrimination indicator. And I'm just concerned, particularly in our contemporary context of rising discrimination and xenophobia, that we make a particular effort to focus on the issues of discrimination, including finding ways to measure that and make sure that the situation is not getting worse. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Very good question. There's a question from this side. No? Yes, sir. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, also the gentleman way up there, right?
Yep. Okay. Thank you. All right. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Shakila. I work for UNDP. I have a bit of technical question. When we talk about inequality beyond income, especially the non-material aspects of inequality, we kind of wouldn't it overlap with the measure or the indicators of poverty? Because when we measure poverty in its multidimensional form, we mostly talk about indicators which are non-income as well. So sometimes it becomes quite difficult to kind of to distinguish between poverty indicators in a multidimensional way and inequality indicators in a multidimensional way, and also because this and also, the kind of debate we should have. Is it like, we should be talking about then poverty is a multidimensional poverty, or we should be talking about inequality? Because, and I would also like to hear from you, is it the inequality that creates a kind of tension in the society, or is it poverty creates tension? Because there are a lot of discussion on inequality, but sometimes I see that, the evidence to prove that, it creates a kind of, disturbance in society is much less than, when it comes to poverty. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And the gentleman at the very back there, thank you.
For giving me. Yeah, thank you very much, sir, for giving me the opportunity. My name is Daniel Chidubang Buji. I'm an African, and I work with a non-for-profit based organization that raises awareness about the impact of climate change. I want to thank the organizers for this event for bringing a topic that is really very sensitive. And the truth of the matter is that reducing inequality just answers the question every one of us here have been trying to answer. Are we truly humans? Are we truly our brother keeper? It just sounds like a big grammar, but it's simple. How can we make the other person that has no blood ties with me, that is not in my geographical place, slightly better? So if we're able to answer that question, I think we should be able to answer the question of how do we move from here? So the question to answer it, how do we progress from here? We must return back to how it is, being our brother's keeper. We must now define a new language. There has to be a new language in the 21st century that defines how leaders can conduct themselves. Young ones need to know, be taught right from their elementary school, that your actions have far-reaching implications. Actions you make out of intention or non-intention have far-reaching implication in the lives of a lot of people. Until we're able to get that, we will only be having statistics show us that income is the problem. It has never been about money. It has always been about people having human face. So if we are to make progress, in my own view, if we are to make progress, we should be looking at how best to create a new human language, a language where we will hold ourselves accountable, a language where our leaders, when they come to this hallowed chamber, will be able to give a report and we'll be able to score them. And those that have not been scored well, we tell you, we cannot give you this exalted platform because we only will be rubbishing the institution that we so held over. Thank you so much, and thank you for the organizers.
Thank you so much, and many thanks for all of those who helped organizing this event on behalf of the three organizations. Right, okay. Right. Yes, madam, forgive me. Okay, you, and then there is another. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Can you press the button, please? Yes.
Now it's on. Thanks. Kate Donovan with ActionAid. And I have a two-headed question, both of them pretty much, I think Dr. Maloney, but whoever can answer it. I found it intriguing that you started with agriculture. And we've been talking about something that I hadn't heard of called agroecology. It's being seen as innovative, although it doesn't sound like it really actually has truly innovative qualities to it, I don't know. And this other idea that increased, whenever you think of innovation or research and development, inevitably I think of industrial agriculture. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. And the other thing that I haven't heard mentioned is tax policy. So, there's always this, and by that I mean, how are we going to make it so that the international tax policy is a little bit fairer for countries, developing countries, which depend a lot more on corporate taxes. And this is a really, I think, a critical issue. There really could be the opportunity for LDCs to generate enough money so that they could do the things that they need to do, including, I suppose, R&D, if that's one thing that's seen, we need more R&D. I'd like to get your reactions on some of these things.
Right, thank you so much. Right, and there was one more question from this side. Yes, madam. Yeah.
It is good. Yeah, hi. So my name is Jessica Huang. I live in the New York metro area. I'm here to ask the panel, the wonderful panel, a question. How do the organizations plan to involve young people? Because I know from my experience, young people really want to dedicate their effort and time to a great cause, but then they often find it difficult to reach out. So how do I actually would like to dedicate this question to Ms. Ebanks, because I'm in the area. I was wondering how New York City plans to involve young people, especially college students who are currently around.
Thank you so much for your question. Yes, the final and last question, this lady at the back. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Samira Savarala. I'm with UNDP in the climate change team. Thank you very much for your comments today. I just wanted to add, I was speaking to a colleague earlier today about the special rapporteur report that he announced, this as climate apartheid. It was a very powerful term to use about this inequality, especially when it comes to climate change and the impacts and the ability to adapt, how those that have more resources will be able to adapt and those that won't. So it's not only that it will exacerbate those inequalities, but it's also how we adapt will be affected as well. And if the panelists have any comments on the human rights piece and this particular issue, I would be very interested in hearing that. Thank you.
Right, so I'll give the panelists 1 minute each, so that will get us to leave this room in 6 minutes or 7. So can we start with you, Ulrika, please?
Thank you. So picking up on the last and also previous comments on human rights and discrimination, I do believe that a rights-based approach to this, and this actually also speaks to the way of bringing young people into the way we work and develop our proposals, is essential, and I think that it needs to be there. It has also to do with the perception part. It has to do with what was mentioned with intersectionality and really understanding reality if we are to address it. So I think, with the question whether the indicators are to be developed or revised, I really think also, on behalf of UNDP, having a strong mandate, working also on governance and rule of law and with the rights-based approach, that it is essential to keep this perspective alive. Also, of course, taxes has been mentioned, and UNDP has a very interesting work together with Tax Inspectors Without Borders. I think that, progressive tax systems, I'm a Swede, so I have an experience of a country working with this, are of course very interesting tools that will need to be looked at. Also how the different social protection schemes, whether they are universal or not, is also important to have a look at if we are to bring people along in the belief that we can do this through progressive tax systems. And then also subsidies, of course, is very important, as we know, also for the climate agenda. Yeah.
Thank you.
Comments.
Ms. Ebanks.
I'll speak specifically, of course, to the youth leadership, to the engagement of young people. New York City has, through New York NYC Service, we have youth leadership councils that are affiliated with many of our city agencies. So you can speak to my team members later and we'll give you some information. The Commission on Gender Equity will be launching its own youth leadership council beginning the fall, because we are very interested in, I don't want to say just engaging youth, but recognizing that young people are already engaged. How do we benefit from their energy in order to build a continuity to the next generation? I think that's really important. And I want to speak to the comments about leadership. What's critically important, I think, is that leadership is seen at every single level, right? And that leadership can be embodied by all individuals, regardless of gender identity, gender expression. We tend to focus a lot on national leadership or global leadership, but local leadership is critical. And you can see, let me put it this way without being political, when your national leadership fails to set the appropriate tone, it becomes incumbent upon local spaces to drive the narrative and to take ownership. And I think it's so important at every single level that we see our local nonprofits are important, our elected officials are important, and I think that's how we drive the balance in order to recognize that for us as a democracy, this dissent and tension is a critical part of democracy. We're not sort of accustomed to it. How do we still stand up and rise and maintain the respect for all humanity in the process?
Right, thank you so much. Mr. Maloney, sir.
Let me try to deal efficiently with these excellent questions, a couple of them. First, the question on the distribution of agricultural production goes way beyond what we can do in 10 seconds here. I refer you to the FAO report, which we draw on the references on the slides. But I also just urge you to meditate on that figure about where agricultural production is going to go up and down as climate change, as temperatures rise. And the decline in productivity is happening exactly where we don't want it to happen. The issue on multidimensional poverty indices, we can get into that a little bit offline. I have a lot of questions. I mean, the answer to your question depends a lot on how we're constructing those indices, and there are lots of issues around that, but we can talk about that offline. The question I wanted to take up, does R&D, my emphasis on that one, I mean R&D very broadly, by the way. I don't necessarily mean, GMOs or whatever. I'm just talking anything that increases the knowledge, the relevant knowledge surrounding the production process, and it could be new crops or whatever. But does that necessarily imply industrial agriculture? And the answer is no, it doesn't. But it doesn't preclude it either, obviously. The rise of the international R&D providing companies can be very useful, particularly in areas where all the other markets we need, finance, education, blah, 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 are missing. So they can be very useful if we can harness them and develop countervailing forces that ensure that everybody benefits. But I just want to stress that in general, I mean, there's also just a huge agenda of increasing R&D around small farmers, around farmers who are distant and the like, distant from population centers and and that is not going to be industrial agriculture. That is just going to be, but we still need to invest in the R&D around that. And I think taking the very last question on the issue of adoption and adapting to climate change, this is, again, meditate on that figure. The only way we're going to get around that red area leading to 2 or 3% fall in income as temperatures rise 1% is if we develop new crops, new strains of crops that are resistant to higher temperatures and to drought and all, and that's going to be a lot of R&D.
Right. Thank you so much. And for the sake of time, I will not insist on my question on social mobility. Dr. Minister?
Yes, thank you. I'll respond to one of the very important questions, which is engaging the youth. And I think engaging the youth is crucial, especially in countries that I said that we're privileged with 60% of our population under the age of 30. So we did two things. The first thing is that we started engaging with all universities. We have ambassadors on the SDGs at universities, so we have now Egyptian Youth 2030 group that are organized by themselves. They are always engaged and they spread awareness inside the universities on the importance of SDGs and the level of the development that Egypt is on the Sustainable Development Agenda. The other thing is that we're working through governorates. We're establishing now development councils inside the governorates. These development councils consist of people that are executives from the government, people from the civil society, from the academia and youth. These development councils are also spreading awareness inside all the governorates and on the local level. In addition to that, we are going to work on having VNRs on the governorate level. This type of VNR on the governorate level will increase the level of engagement and the level of awareness because really development comes from the bottom, not from the top. Thank you.
Right, so New York perhaps will get 27 kind of possible competition from Egypt on government-based, city-based VNRs. Sarah.
Thank you. Two of the questions very quickly. I'll leave the indicators to Elliot, but the point on non-discrimination in general as coming out as an important part of the solution, I think is key. The removal of discriminatory laws, but also the translation of that into practice. And often we have a gap between what is on the legal books and what is actually practiced, broader access to justice also. We have 1.5 billion people with unresolved legal needs in the world, and that forms part of the inequality problem we face. On the evidence question, I would just say that we do actually have very good evidence on the links from inequality. The IMF has actually produced excellent work on the links between inequality and growth, and the links between inequality and conflict is covered in the UN World Bank Pathways to Peace report very comprehensively. So I think that the evidence is there.
Eric.
Thank you, Mahmoud. On the indicators question, first, I don't believe that there is any sort of conflict or trade-off between multidimensional indicators of poverty, multidimensional indicators of inequality. I think we need to look at both, because otherwise we would miss a piece of the picture. Now, over the past 2 weeks, I've had the opportunity to be in 3 side events that talked about localizing the SDGs, carrying it down to the subnational level. Fascinating stuff. This is how we're going to get this thing done, because policy doesn't happen at the national level, it happens where people live. But what we've also heard, and this is a specific response to our colleague from OHCHR, is that the indicators question is a much different proposition when you're at the local level, where people are trying to figure out, well, how do we measure what we're doing on the ground? And a very complicated and overly complex edifice of indicators is not something that they are particularly interested in. And now, I'm not even talking about the question of whether they can afford to do it. They're just not interested in a lot of extremely complicated indicators, because that's not what they're monitoring. And we've been 4 years in the interagency and expert group trying to get to a stage where the second tier indicators can be generally agreed, and we haven't got very far with regard to even discussing the third tier indicators. And we need to ask ourselves, well, what do countries want in terms of indicators that inform policy? And so we need to be very careful. What we've been trying to do from a technical perspective is give a proper indicator for every single target. That may not necessarily be what is needed. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Very good, and I have good announcement to make for those who seek knowledge. So in addition to the 4 reports mentioned by Bill Maloney, he's now telling me that there is a 5th one on space shaping productivity policies. So that would deal with other aspects of discussion that had been highlighted today. It has been a fascinating panel, and at the very end of a very rich week of discussions and dialogue for very important topics. I'd like really to thank you all. And before you leave, there is a question pending and has no answer for almost 10 years. If you are confronted with an opportunity, a big investment opportunity that would increase inequality in the short term and enhance the FDI volume, would you do it or you will not? This was a question that was raised to Professor Mike Spence when he was preparing his report on inclusive development and sustainable growth. Don't be confused, that was the title. And then everybody asked, well, you have been emphasizing this issue of inclusive growth and equity, but if you have an opportunity to increase investment and growth, but will result in inequality in the short term, will you accept it and clean up after that, or you say, no, thank you, I don't need your investment? It's a case-specific political economy kind of a question for your entertainment, perhaps, especially for the ministers. But having said that, I'm very grateful for your time and for your engagement at this stage. And please join me in thanking the great panelists, including Sarah, who just left to catch a train.